and welcome to part 2 of our lesson 2 on the prologue and the first commandment in our study on the 10 Commandments. In our last video, we talked really deeply about the prologue and why that prologue is so powerful and really so special. In this video, we're going to talk about the first commandment. And that commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. I think that for us, as we read the 10 Commandments, this commandment just kind of feels a little, duh. In our monotheistic culture, we really can't understand what it would be like to have to make a choice between a variety of gods. Or at least it feels that way for us. And that's really because we've sort of lost the context we had of the ancient Near East and that fertile mythological ground that existed in that area. So let's get a little socio-religious historical perspective. Better. If you are to think back to anything you might have learned about the ancient Near East when you took world history, maybe, you would remember that the ancient Near East was rife with mythological deities. There were many, many gods in the ancient Near East. Marduk, for instance, is the patron god of Babylon. Asher is the patron god of Assyria. Baal is a Canaanite god, which means that this god actually came out of the Semitic tradition that many of the Hebrew people understood. And what we find is that many of the cultures of the Near East had this sort of pantheon of gods that were in competition with each other and really had quite a bit of overlap. In fact, in many areas, because of conquest and migration, there really weren't clear demarcations of faith practices, and different pantheons were often intermixed as households and communities took on these gods, the gods of their conquerors and neighbors, based on the idea that if your God blessed you, then maybe if I worship your God will bless me too. The ancient Near East becomes a sort of religious melting pot or chopped salad, depending which metaphor you prefer. Sometimes it was forced. Sometimes it was optional, but it was always, always a little bit murky. And so for us, when we read this commandment through our 21st century lens, we assume that this commandment is evoking monotheism. But really, because the ancient Near East had so many different gods and pantheons of gods, really what we're doing here is not talking about monotheism, but rather monolatry. So what is monolatry? Well, it's the worship of one God without denying the existence of others. In fact, much of Old Testament theology is based on monolatry. Monotheism is a relatively new development that happens in the Old Testament. And so it's important to think about monolatry in the case of the giving of the law. Why? Why do I want you to know this term? Well, I want you to consider the landscape of the ancient Near East in terms of human free will, right? Obedience, a robotic response. In fact, we sort of touched on that in our last video. Obedience isn't this automatic response that happens, but it becomes a choice that one makes. And it's a choice that one has to make over and over and over again. In the ancient Near East, that choice was related to a pantheon of gods that one was presented with at every turn. And I mean literally at every turn. You see, shrines to gods existed all over the place. You couldn't walk down the street and turn a corner without running face to face with a shrine for a god. In fact, sometimes in houses, you couldn't go from one room to another without running face to face into a shrine for another god. They are literally everywhere in this context. And so the choice to worship one God over all of these other gods is really a choice of monolatry as opposed to a choice of monotheism. Now, today, we're much less likely to have to make a choice between our God of the Bible and say, Marduk, right? But we're still faced with a choice of gods. And I think sometimes it's easier for us to consider ourselves as monolatrous as opposed to monotheistic, because I think over and over again, we find ourselves not being very monotheistic. So, what are some of the gods that we have a choice of these days? And I don't mean something like Ganesh, right? Although perhaps in our multicultural context, that might be a thing. Really, though, what do these gods look like? Could it be the god of money, the god of success, the god of being liked? Now, some of you out there may be like, well, Alyssa, those are false gods. Well, maybe we can consider them false gods and through a monotheistic lens. But there's still things that compete for our attention. Really, at the end of the day, I think we're far more likely to find ourselves trying to be monolatrous than monotheistic. So, if these choices are the choices that we're faced with, the choice to be monolatrous over all the pantheon of gods in our 21st century, I can think about some of those, right? Like perhaps wanting the newest, latest technology and always chasing after that. It's possible to even put the success of your children into the status of God. The God becomes anything that we worship and put all of our energies into. And yet we come back to this first commandment that says, you shall have no other gods before me. Why is it so hard to put aside other gods in favor who has delivered us out of slavery? I think that is a really important question. And it's a question that I hope that you discuss in your group when you all meet together. But consider that question. Why is it so hard for us to be monolatrous, considering that the God who's asking us to put no one before God is the same God that delivered us out of slavery and into freedom? Think deep about that, and I cannot wait to join you again for our next deep dive into the 10 Commandments.